Hey guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Psalm 95 is a call to worship, and the psalm is primarily about worship. The first section in verses 1 through 5 are about the exaltation of God. Verse 6 and 7 are about the lowliness of man. So you have this idea of worship is the exaltation of God, but also mankind bowing low before the Lord. And then this connection made between those two things in a relationship type atmosphere where it says, we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. And so we realize that God is high and exalted, way above us. And yet at the same time, we bow low before him, all the while recognizing that there's a connection between us and him, even though he is so exalted and even though we are so low, and that we are his people. We are the sheep of his hand. And so this is worship, recognizing God's exaltation, our lowliness, but yet the connection and relationship that we have with God. It's a beautiful description of what worship is all about. However, as you get to the end of the psalm, it almost seems as though this beautiful picture of worship is interrupted by a warning. And it is. In the middle part of verse 7, or the latter part of verse 7, it says, "Today, if you will hear his voice," and it continues on, "do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as in the day of Massa in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation, and said, they are a people who err in their heart, and they do not know my ways. Therefore I swore in my anger, truly they shall not enter into my rest." So warning here. In the midst of this beautiful worship and this call to worship, in which there's this exaltation of God and this call for lowliness and heart for man and humbling themselves before God, and this connection and relationship, God is warning them, don't test me. Don't try me like the people did in the wilderness. And he recalls back to their minds Meribah and Massa, which was a time in which the people were grumbling about water. And where Moses struck the rock and the water came out. But before that happened, the people were grumbling and complaining and saying, the Lord just brought us out here. You're grumbling against Moses, said, you brought us out here in this wilderness just so that we could die. We'd be better off just staying in Egypt, basically. And they just really complained and grumbled about that. And the Lord said, these people tested me and they tried me. Even though they had seen my work, they'd seen the plagues, they'd seen the dividing of the Red Sea, they'd seen the manna on the ground, they'd seen his acts of grace towards them, and yet they still were hardened in their hearts. They did not place trust and faith in the Lord. And therefore he says, for 40 years I loathed that generation. And the idea here is that God was basically nauseous of them. Very similar to what you find later on in the book of Revelation, where he talks about spewing people out of his mouth. Those who were lukewarm, that type of thing. But just the Lord loathed that generation because they weren't walking by faith. They weren't trusting him. They weren't applying themselves to know his ways. They were going their own direction. And he said, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. And that's true. I mean, it was true of them. The rest that they would have been thinking of would have been the rest that Joshua was supposed to give them as they entered into the new land, into the promised land, and a land flowing with milk and honey, with basically vineyards and farms that they could just inhabit. And they didn't have to build for themselves. They could just go in the land and rest. But the book of Hebrews teaches us that there was a future rest that this psalm actually implies, a future rest for the people of God, the rest found in Jesus Christ. But nonetheless, the idea of trust and faith and then in rest is connected, and that's always a connection in scriptures. Our God is a God of rest. We see that in the creation when he rested on the seventh day. He's also a God who invites his people into rest. We saw that with Israel, in him inviting the people to the Sabbath day, every seventh day of the week. And then in connection to the various feasts, they had these Sabbath rests. The land was to rest every 7 years. God is a God of rest, and he invites his people into rest. That's fulfilled in Jesus Christ as we rest in him, trust in him, We find a righteousness not based upon our works, but based upon his accomplished work on the cross. And then also points towards the future when we will find rest from our labors here on this earth, and we'll be living in a heavenly reality in which we will find rest in the Lord. But there's a connection between trust and rest even today in our lives, each and every day as we walk before the Lord. If we live like the people in the wilderness, if we're constantly grumbling against the Lord, if we're constantly not trusting the Lord, if we're constantly going our own way, we're not really concerned about learning the ways of the Lord, that leads to no rest at all. There is no rest there. It just leads to consternation, conflict, angst within us. It doesn't lead to rest at all. But those who really trust the Lord, who give their lives over to the Lord, submitting to the Lord, resting in the faithfulness of God, they're the ones that really find the rest. It's kind of like driving or riding in a vehicle. You know, your amount of rest really depends on how much you trust the driver. If you're riding in a car with a person who you trust their driving abilities, you can rest. You might even take a nap. You might literally rest because you know the person driving is trustworthy. They're a trustworthy driver. They'll do everything in their power to get you to your destination safely, and you can rest, trusting in the driver. But you also know probably from experience a time in which maybe you didn't trust the driver, whoever it might be, and there you couldn't rest. You felt like you had to watch their every move. You had to make sure they stayed awake. You had to, kind of try to stay a step ahead of them to make sure they didn't put you in a dangerous situation. And you couldn't rest because you didn't trust the driver. Well, we got to ask ourselves, do we trust the driver? God is in control. He is the one that's sovereign above our lives and intricately involved in everything that goes on in our lives. Do we trust the Lord? Or do we not trust the Lord? If we trust the Lord, it'll lead to rest. We can say, the Lord's got this situation. I can hand it over to him. I can rest in his faithfulness. He is a trustworthy God. But if I don't trust the Lord, then I will not enter into rest. I'll be constantly disturbed and anxious and worried and concerned, perhaps grumbling and complaining. Now, we need to be people who trust in the Lord and place our faith in the Lord. Those who place their faith in the Lord always find rest. And if we want to live a life of rest, and if we want to find rest at the end of our lives, we just place our faith in the Lord. Trust in his promises, trust in his word, and lean on him. And know that if he's driving the car, he's going to do the best to get us to our destination. We just have to place our trust in him. So hopefully this psalm will help us to realize that worship is important. Exalting God is important. Bowing low before the Lord is important. Recognizing the relationship that we have between us and the Lord is important. But also living a life of trusting the Lord is also important and is a part of the whole package of worship that we offer to the Lord. So these are some things we can think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.